From the Free Press, this is Honestly, and I'm Barry Weiss. Depending on who you ask, some would call the ultra-rich shameless, but others might describe them as aspirational. Here's what I mean. Mukesh Ambani, the Indian centibillionaire, has a room of snow in the Indian tropics. And this is to say nothing of his skyscraper home, his 168-car garage, and his 600-person staff. Oh, and his son's wedding? It featured Rihanna and Beyoncé. Aristotle Onassis had whale's teeth carved into pornographic scenes from the Odyssey. I swear to God. And stools that were upholstered in whale skins that he kept aboard his yacht. Because where else would you keep that kind of thing? And one hedge fund billionaire, whose name you won't even know, bought a 14-foot preserved shark in formaldehyde. Why? Why not? These opulent displays of wealth just scratch the surface. There are blood boys, Basquiats, and bunkers for this crew. Many of them in New Zealand, of course, to prepare for the end of the world. Whether it's the Kochs or the Kardashians, we cannot look away, or at least most of us can't. But one question remains. Do Americans loathe or love the ultra-rich? That is one of the questions raised by Evan Osnos in his new book, The Haves and the Have-Yachts. Evan is a staff writer at The New Yorker and an author several times over. In his newest book, he investigates how this class of people, the have-yachts, got their money, how they spend it, and how they fight to preserve it. It paints a fascinating picture, not just about America and capitalism, but more fundamentally about human nature and the status games we play. The book feels eerily relevant in the present moment because of our social and political breakdown, fueled, perhaps above all, by rage at the economic picture, particularly at our economic inequality. As Zora Mamdani, the self-proclaimed socialist and likely next mayor of New York, says that billionaires should not exist, and as anti-elite sentiment grows on the right through voices like Tucker Carlson and Marjorie Taylor Greene. Today on Honestly, I ask Evan Osnos what this level of income inequality means for America. Is a revolt or even a revolution in our future? And how is AI going to supercharge an already precarious status quo? Stay with us. Evan Osnos, welcome to Honestly.
Thanks, Barry. Great to be with you.
Okay, well, you and I were just in Sun Valley for this Allen & Co. conference. You have taken up residency, as we can see from the decor behind you. I guess you're never leaving Idaho. And we're sort of like a few of the steerage class people there, you could say. We're the journalists among
That's well put.
What has been called summer camp for billionaires. And I guess I just wanted to ask you, given this book that you've just put out about the lifestyles of the hyper-rich and other things as well, which we're going to get into, is quiet luxury still in style, or have the tides turned in the aftermath of the Bezos wedding?
You know, it does feel as if the pendulum may be swinging back to something, shall we call it, unquiet luxury. I think there is this constant aesthetic competition between people who want to, as one source of mine once put it, look like their gardener, and somebody else who actually says, I want the world to see who I am. And at the moment, I think that there is still very much a feeling of, I think people are staying a bit under the radar, with some big obvious exceptions like the one we saw in Venice. But I think there's a lot of unease, actually, Barry. I think there's a lot of unease. As one former hedge fund manager said to me, when there are 25 hedge fund managers who have as much as all the kindergarten teachers in America, he says it doesn't feel very good to be one of those 25. So there's a little bit of quietude, I think, about it.
I think that all of us in the steerage class among the hyper wealthy, but then also just normal people, like to gawk at the hyper wealthy. But I think, and that's fun, and we're going to talk about that. But I think the stakes of this, to set the tone for the listener, are profoundly political and social ones. In other words, it's one thing to enjoy reading about the swag that was given out at the Bezos wedding, but it's another to kind of pan out at 10,000 feet or higher, and maybe we'll take a Blue Origin or whatever it's called, spacecraft to look at the big picture, and really understand what the political implications of that are. So I want to get to that. Let's start, though, by setting the scene with your excellent new book, which is called The Have and the Have Yachts, which is a phenomenal title, because it really helps, I think, normal people that listen to this show, this upper crust of wealthy individuals. And you open the book with a glimpse into the world of yachts, a world, I will say, that is foreign to me, even as someone that has gone to the Allen and Company conference. I have never been on a yacht. And you explain to me all of the different features here, whether it's Danish versus Italian made and the implications of that, series versus custom, how people helicopter in bagels from Zabar's and rare melons from Japan. And you argue in this book that yachts are one of the few remaining ways that distinguish the merely rich from the profoundly rich. And I want you to tell us a little bit about this latter group, the have yachts. How many people are we talking about? Who are we talking about? And why yachts?
Well, to put it in very crisp terms, in 1990, there were only 10 of these giant yachts, what are known as giga yachts, a term that perhaps you will never encounter unless you plunge into this world for a while. Instead of 10, today there are more than 170. And then beyond those giant yachts, which are really close to 300 feet, about the size of a football field, longer in some cases, they'll cost more than $500 million. There are also then about 5,000 what are called super yachts, but today they've gotten dwarfed by some of the real leviathans, these giants that I was just talking about a moment ago, that in the industry, I find this to be quite a revealing tiny detail. Within the industry, those ordinary super yachts are now known as pocket yachts, which gives you a feel, right, Barry? It gives you a feel for the fact that—
Just a little Polly Pocket in your pocket.
That's it. Just something just to tuck away. And I think, in a way, part of what attracted me to this topic, we're going to talk about the underlying historical and political factors, but it's also an act of sociology. I'm interested in the fact that human beings will rank ourselves, and we are constantly finding hierarchies. You put two people in an elevator by themselves, and they will find a way for one to feel superior to the other. And it's interesting to find out what it is in that world that makes one person feel, shall we say, more powerful than another. And I mean, there was one particularly tart observation that an owner of one of the world's most expensive yachts said to a guest of his who relayed the story to me. He said, you and I both fly privately. We both have drivers. We both have chefs. He said, the one way that I can signal to the rest of the world that I am in a different effing category than you is the boat. And in a way, there's a lot contained within there. And I think that we are living in a time right now when there is a group of people who are, let's call them the have yachts, that's how I think of it, that are exerting an extraordinary level of control over the lives of others, politically, socially, in influence terms. Look, everybody who watched the Bezos wedding on Instagram was participating, in a sense, in that world. But in sheer political terms, it's quite astonishing. Just to give you one statistic, in 2004, Barry, billionaires in this country contributed about $13 million, with an M, to the presidential election in that year. Fast forward 20 years, and as a result of Citizens United and other changes, billionaires put in 200 times as much into the government, about $3 billion into that election. So we see the effect of that reverberating through our politics, and I think it's worth us understanding more about what makes that world tick.
Evan, back up a second and just put this in historical context, because there's an argument that people will make who are maybe sympathetic to the have yachts and say, sorry, we've always had a class of have yachts. They might not have had white boats. They had other things. But look at the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, the the Morgans, whoever. Met more of these names than I do. You are a WASP, in fact, or at least half so, as you write in the introduction to your book. But what makes this class and this moment different? Because we used to have robber barons and used to be a huge amount of wealth in the hands of a few families. How is this moment and how are these people distinct from those names that affix our libraries and other public institutions?
Yeah, there is a difference in terms of quantity and in the culture around it. In sheer numerical terms, we've now crossed into a period in which the share of wealth that is controlled by the folks at the very, very top now exceeds the share of wealth that was controlled by the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, and the Rockefellers at the peak of the end of the Gilded Age, which was in 1913, was the peak of John D. Rockefeller's wealth. And at the time, it's also worth pointing out that even if you go more recently into, let's say, the 1960s, you had very wealthy individuals in this country, but the ratio between the CEO and the average frontline worker was profoundly different. I mean, if you take public companies, the median CEO made about 20 times what a frontline worker did in 1968. Today, it's, according to the latest data, about 350 to 1. And so there has been a change both in that relationship as well, in terms of what the CEO class and investors and other financial titans have been able to achieve. And so that then has an impact across society. I think you have to talk also in even larger terms, putting it in a broader context of history. I spoke to archaeologists, in fact, for this book, and he said the people who built the pyramids were living in a less unequal society. So we are actually now, by the sheer fact of the extraordinary success of wealth creation over the last generation, we're in uncharted territory. And it's worth reminding ourselves, because it can be a little bit like frogs in boiling water, that things have changed. 10 years ago, Barry, there were no centibillionaires in this country. Nobody had more than $100 billion. Now there are 15 people with that level. And to take the prime example, perhaps, Elon Musk, 10 years ago, had about 10 billion. Today, he has at least 400 billion. So it is hard. As one archaeologist put it to me, he said, what we're really asking is whether Elon Musk is richer than Tutankhamun. He says it's hard to make a detailed comparison, but it's not an unreasonable question.
One of the things that I found myself thinking this past week, and also as I was reading your book, are just status games and why human beings need status games in order to feel themselves, I guess, to be strong or better. Like, what is it about human beings? Because you did a lot of research sort of into historical wealth for this book. What is it about us that needs to be like the guy on the boat saying, we both fly private, we both have the private chef, we both have all the things in the world, but I need this boat to indicate to people that I'm in a different fucking class than you? Talk to me about what it is about us, whether it's the person that's going for, the co-op on the Upper West Side or the person on the Giga yacht. What is it about us that needs that, do you think?
At the deepest level, there is a biological imperative. This is partly about resource acquisition, the idea that if I can dominate the person next to me, then I am more likely to be able to get the necessary, call them nutrients, either literal or environmental, that allow me to then pass on my family. I think if you study, in fact, as course of this project, I talked to people who study early chiefdom. These are some of the first people to rise out of these agrarian collectives, these very earliest settlements that we had. And one of the things that they'll tell you, the chieftains were essentially the proto-oligarchs of their time. And one of the characteristics that comes through is what's known to some scholars as the AAA personality, meaning that they are aggressive, acquisitive, and assertive. And in the early millennia, really, of this phenomenon, you can go all the way back to look at Mesopotamian cultures or early Scandinavian cultures where you had chieftains rise up for the first time. That usually took the form of a religious expression. So somebody would come out initially as they'd be a shaman or they'd be a religious leader. They would use that, what we would now call riz, essentially, to establish themselves in the minds of the public as more capable, more aggressive, more willing to dominate. But when you eventually refract that through a modern economic system, that generally ends up taking the form of precisely the comment that you mentioned earlier, in which somebody will say to his considerably wealthy friend, I am still able to dominate you.
Talk to me for a second about the rules in talking about money, which is something that I find totally fascinating. And I think there are different rules depending on how long you've had the money. Let's just put it that way. And maybe even different rules depending on where you come from yourself, self-made versus inherited, et cetera. One of the details I find really interesting is that the yacht class does not really, or is not really supposed to call these boats yachts, which sort of speaks to the unspoken norms and rules of this group. I guess they call them more like boats or white boats, which is hilarious because it makes it seem like it could as easily be a dinghy as it could be a giga yacht.
Boston whaler's a white boat too, but that's not what they're talking about.
Exactly. So talk a little bit about the kind of rules, the culture, the norms of this group.
Yeah, I find some of that, call it the subtle gestures of meaning around the aesthetics to be quite revealing, partly because those are indicators of in-group and out-group distinctions. And this is as old as society itself. But if we're talking about this community, one of the things you learn early on is that nobody who owns one of these vessels would ever in a million years actually call it a giga yacht, or frankly, even a yacht. You're generally, if they're inviting you on, they say, we're going to be out on the boat going to Indonesia in September, you really should pop over. And I think in a way, part of the power move, by the way, is the short notice, spontaneous invitation, because the implication, of course, is that you are in such control of your own world that you can tell your company, I'm going to be gone for a week and unreachable, or I'll be gone, but you can only reach me at midnight your time because I'm going to be in the South Pacific. So,
or I'll jump on my helicopter and land on your yacht.
Precisely.
An overheard conversation that I was privy to was a conversation about how an invitation to one of these boats to the outsider can seem like such an exciting proposition. But in reality, you're just trapped in the middle of the ocean. Like it's the same problem as being a guest to anyone, which is how fun can that actually be, especially when you're not actually on land and there's nowhere to escape.
Yeah, there is a really unspoken piece of this, and it's a bit of a subtle reveal, actually. But the fact is, if you've been invited onto the boat, you're not there to just paddleboard and flounder around and hang out in the sun and catch up on issues of Vanity Fair. Like the truth is, you're there to be entertaining.
You are the ultimate dancing monkey.
Yeah, well, that's the fact. So if you're coming, let's say, from Wall Street, people want to understand what you know. Give us an insight, something we're not going to see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. If you're coming from Hollywood, you better have some fun stories about stars and some of the crazy games that you're aware of. There's a way in which people sometimes find themselves on a boat, and as one frequent guest said to me, by day 3, I'm completely exhausted because you are at the beck and call of the host. When they want to eat, you shall eat. When they will sleep, you are sleeping. And so let's say it's a vacation with an asterisk next to it.
Okay, so yachts are like the biggest ticket item and obviously the most apparent, the least quiet of the luxuries. But you write about how this group chooses to spend their money in lots of ways. And I want to just talk about a few of them because I found them totally fascinating and revealing. You have a section on what you call the Hollywood privates, which is booking artists like Rihanna or J-Lo or Beyoncé for things like weddings and bar mitzvahs and birthdays. And it's hilarious because to most people, you think about Rihanna, J-Lo, and Beyoncé as being the super rich.
Right.
But really what this is people that are the super rich being recast into a servitude role for the hyper rich. Tell us a little bit about that dynamic.
Yeah, you put it well. In some ways, we learn that everybody is in the service industry for somebody else. At a certain point, there, it used to be that the wealthiest people in the world could afford to, get front row seats at an arena, or, you might get a skybox, for instance, at Madison Square Garden and watch your favorite artist. That's pretty old, actually. At this point now, people are hiring pop stars to play their kids' birthday parties, bar mitzvahs, sweet 16. I have to say, as a journalist, perhaps the most fun I've had was when I embedded with Flo Rida, the hip hop star, for a bar mitzvah in Chicago. I said, I could die happy tomorrow. I think I've done everything I might ever want to do.
That is a really cursed sentence. Tell us a little bit about that. Like, how many of these does Flo Rida do? Is he just like on the bar mitzvah circuit?
He is actually not only doing parties in the United States, he's also traveling around the world. And he told me once about a gig that was arranged on a private super yacht. He showed up and he said, I got on board, and he's kind of used to this by now. He was somewhere off the coast of Sardinia, and he thought, okay, I figure I'm going to get up onto the deck and there's going to be a bunch of screaming 13-year-olds because that's kind of my key demographic. He got on board, and instead of it being a group of kids, it was just 3 or 4 people sitting at a table waiting quietly for him to begin performing. And if anybody knows Flo Rida, he sings songs like Low about, the girl with the apple-bottom jeans and
boots with the fur.
Wow. See, there we go.
If I were to bar mitzvah and Flo Rida come out, I would think it was the end of, I would think it's both, this is the end of the Jewish people and probably America, but I would also enjoy the song.
It would be a double-sided experience.
So three adults at a table with basically listening to stripper music.
That's right. And he realized in that moment, in that little half instant, that he said, the only way I'm getting off this boat with my fee is by just going ahead with it. And so there he did, and he performed his heart out. And he's a pro, and he, came to do his job.
How much does he get paid for one of these private gigs?
His rates are about $250,000 in the United States, and they'll get above $1 million overseas. And he'll do dozens a year, 20, 30 events a year. So his earnings are substantial, according to his own lawyer, who talked to me about it. I kind of found it to be a fascinating little window into a piece of the cultural economy that we hear about, in little vague terms, but we don't often get to see from the inside. For this book, I interviewed a lot of artists about their experience in the private gig market. And to be honest with you, Barry, a lot of people don't want to talk about it. The clients don't want to talk about it. The artists don't, because for a long time it was kind of considered kind of bad form to do these gigs. It was basically like old crooners who did it. And now, as one agent said to me, when people call me up and they say, do you have anybody on your list who does a gig like this? They say, yeah, pretty much almost everybody will be willing to do it for the right price.
Well, there's the fact that it was kind of an old crooner thing to do, but it's also that some of the clients are just so profoundly, unsavory would be an understatement. I pulled this one paragraph that I just need to read because it speaks to the level of unsavoriness. Okay. Before the Libyan dictator, this is you, Muammar Gaddafi, was toppled in 2011, members of his family organized events enlivened by 50 Cent, Mariah Carey, Usher, and Nelly Furtado. That made me sad, as I really like her. During the Arab Spring, when Gaddafi unleashed his forces on protesters, Carey expressed regret, and the rest of the performers announced plans to donate their windfall to charity. But that kerfuffle, you write, did not deter others. In 2013, Jennifer Lopez, or J-Lo, was hired by the China National Petroleum Corporation to do an event for executives in Turkmenistan, which culminated in her singing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" to, pronounce this name for me, Gurbanguly Berdi Muhammadov?
Yeah, Barhim Muhammadov is.
I did okay.
Yeah, that was pretty good, actually.
But what listeners need to know is that he is one of the most repressive despots in the world. After a video of the serenade emerged, Lopez's spokesman assured fans, had there been knowledge of human rights issues of any kind, Jennifer would not have attended, which was hilarious. The Human Rights Foundation, an advocacy group based in New York, subsequently estimated that Lopez garnered at least $10 million in fees for performing for crooks and dictators from Eastern Europe and Russia. Thor Halvorsen, the foundation's president, also a friend of mine, asked, what's next stop on her tour? Syria? It was just such a delightful, like the amount of just unsavory things in that one paragraph is sort of astonishing. Is there, at this point, is like, I remember when Jennifer Lopez did that. I remember that. And I remember that moment because the Arab Spring had happened and it was just seemed like so sort of tawdry and tone deaf. Now I don't know if people would even care.
Yeah, you've hit on a cultural evolution in a sense because, look, part of what was happening then was that this was all, it felt almost like it was in another galaxy. Somebody like J-Lo would get one of these offers. The numbers were just almost unimaginably large. And she'd think, who's ever going to know that I'm over there? And it's worth noting, I didn't put it in the description, but she was wearing traditional local garb when she sang Happy Birthday. And there was a way in which it was the kind of thing that one does when they are feeling like, I'm on another planet from home. And are my fans really going to care? And I think that the world has shrunk. And in the ways that we all recognize, those decisions, those scenes have a way of creeping back in to the domestic conversation. And suddenly they look really different and pretty embarrassing.
Well, it's because the way I think about it is just the room is never the room, right? The room is the whole internet always now. And so anything you do, it's like, are you actually speaking to the 50 or 1,000 people in front of you, or are you speaking to the entire internet, which sort of changes the game, obviously.
I think there's also something revealing in this fast-growing piece of the cultural economy. Let's set aside the J-Los of the world for a minute. For actually the artists who are out there trying to be working musicians, they're living through this complete transformation in how you make a living. I mean, a generation ago, when somebody somewhere bought the last compact disc, they didn't even know they were doing it, but it was the end of an era. And with that, also an entire livelihood went out the door for people who are, let's say they're the trumpet player in the back of a Steely Dan concert, or a drummer who goes out and plays gigs with Duran Duran or something. I mean, I'm naming particularly old-fashioned acts precisely because there used to be a decent business in that. But when there was no more recording and publishing income, they now make a fraction of a penny from each play on Spotify. And a lot of those deals are very hard to negotiate because the streamers have all the leverage. And so they have gone back. It's kind of an interesting case, Barry, of people going back to a much earlier generation of how they work, which is they're now back to being, in a sense, busking. They just happen to be busking in the backyard of $1 billion compound in Mountain View.
Yes, that is such a smart way to put it. I mean, I think the other part of it is that a lot of these, at least the entertainment figures we've been talking about, come from pretty profound scarcity in a way that a lot of these, let's just say, the chairman of Turkmenistan or the titans of Chinese petroleum don't. And so it's like, grab the bag while you can.
I totally think so. And I came through that experience not being all that judgmental at all about the artists who are trying to make their way in this world, because they're simply doing what it is that the culture is telling them is the right move, which is, as you say, get that bag. I mean, there was almost literally an example of that. Recently, during the inauguration ceremonies, one of the parties had a hip-hop star play, and some of his fans said, why are you playing at an event for somebody we don't agree with politically? And he basically said, look, they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. I'm paraphrasing here. It was a huge amount of money. And so he did it. And I think we are perhaps holding artists to an unfair standard if we say, it's not okay for you to do that, but it's perfectly fine for somebody else to sell their work of art to a leader that we might not agree with if it's going to hang on their dacha somewhere halfway around the world.
So one of the ways that they have yachts spend their money is on incredible leisure, most notably the giga yachts. But at the other end of the spectrum, they spend a lot of money on, I guess, what we could call very, very luxurious high-end doomsday prepping. And I'm totally endlessly fascinated by this topic, both the end of the world and how to prepare for it, and if any of that preparation will ever actually work. But can you explain what they're buying, where, and why?
This started really just within the last decade and a half, meaning some of the wealthiest people in the United States and abroad, particularly in Silicon Valley and in Wall Street, started to get uneasy about the direction of the country. And they said things are getting more polarized, it's getting fiercer, and we need to start making preparations. As one hedge fund manager described to me, he says, I remember being around a dinner table not long after 9/11, and people were starting to talk about if society falls apart or we find ourselves in a crisis, are we going to be able to even get to our private planes in time to fly away? And then somebody else said, well, not just that, but how do you know that the pilot is not just going to take the plane for himself and his family? So have you thought about that? Are you making precautions and preparations to ensure that his family is going with you? And it became this, in a way, I think a form of therapeutic thinking. It was like, okay, I can't solve the actual underlying socioeconomic and political causes. So I'm just going to engage in this. It was a bit of sci-fi bro palliative sort of therapeutic care. But underneath it was the recognition of a real sense from people who have prospered precisely by seeing around corners in our economy and our society that we are heading into uncertain territory. And Steve Huffman, who was a co-founder and CEO of Reddit, he talked to me about the fact that he got eye surgery because he didn't want to have to depend on contact lenses or glasses in the event of a societal breakdown. He said, without glasses, he said, I'm fucked. And he said, I've got guns and motorcycles and gold, and I think I could probably survive. But then that led me on this path of meeting really tons of people in Silicon Valley who have done versions of this. I think part of what's going on, Barry, is that the same kind of mind that equips you to be able to imagine completely path-breaking innovations that nobody has thought of, essentially kind of utopian technological worlds, also lead you to think about dystopian worlds. It's two halves of the same thought process. And at the same time, they're acutely aware that the very technologies that they're making both allow us to organize and agitate through social media in ways that we were previously unable to do. Steve Huffman, for instance, watched the mortgage crisis reverberate through public attitudes right there in comments on Reddit. But then also they're acutely aware, and several of them mentioned to me, that they think that AI will eventually turn public attention against Silicon Valley, and they will find themselves in an uncomfortable position of public distress.
For those who have not, this is in the book, but I so remember reading your New Yorker piece. I think it was in 2016 or 2017 about doomsday preppers, and there was a some kind of like condo project in the middle of the country. And that one looked pretty bleak. It was like, I remember a picture of like a dentist chair, like they had a hospital set up and all of this stuff. And then the people that could afford like spreads underground in New Zealand. Am I remembering this?
You're absolutely right. The Condo Project that you're remembering happens to be inside a nuclear-hardened missile silo, a decommissioned Cold War.
Yes, it was
Cold
very
War
bleak.
missile silo. And, they've livened it up by putting some LED windows, quote unquote, on the wall that will show you scenes of whatever world you will never see again on the outside. But, you could choose to look at a beautiful alpine vista, or as actually one client there did, they wanted a perfect round-the-clock representation of Central Park with all the birds chirping and the cars honking the kind of hollow sounds of night. And that was the world that they would be subjected to for as many years as they'd be living in this missile silo. And, there was kind of also hilarious details because, like any high-end real estate or, middle to high-end, it had its share of drama. And in one case, one of the clients had insisted on painting his condo in the colors that he liked in the tropics, so like bright orange and yellow and green. And it was making everybody sick. And so they had to come in and his decorator had to redo it. But a lot of these scenes started to feel to me like these are they're little emblems of a social period of real oddity when we're not quite sure how to process some of the stresses in our politics and our society. I mean, there's a kind of centripetal force, and we feel it. I think we usually talk about it in the language of polarization, because that's certainly one of the manifestations. But what it really is about is people living lives of such difference in ideas and experience, even life expectancy, that it can feel as if there is a sense of fragility. And for some people, it's precariousness at the bottom. And for others, it's a feeling almost of exposure and vertigo at the top, this feeling that they are seen and perhaps uncomfortable with it.
Well, so for the sort of upper class, there's this compound in Kansas. I think it was in Kansas. But for the have yachts, there's New Zealand. I think Peter Thiel has a compound in New Zealand. Tell us why New Zealand, and if you could, give us some of those household names that have decided that that is the place they're going to go when the world ends.
Yeah, I will say your intrepid correspondent here got on a plane and went to New Zealand in order to report on this.
Is it gorgeous?
It's spectacular. I mean, I landed and it felt like the most beautiful day that's ever been had in Santa Barbara. It was a sort of bugless, humidity-free, 75 degrees. And the thing about it, even more powerful than just the comforts, let's be honest, is that what used to be a great affliction for New Zealand, what's called the tyranny of distance is how they talk about it, being so far away from everything else in the world, has suddenly become a tremendous asset. Because when you live in a shrinking world in which everybody's connected to one another digitally and we're constantly infused with information, even if you might be on your yacht in the South Pacific, you can look online and discover that your net worth is collapsing. But if you're in New Zealand, there is still that physical distance from the rest of the world. In answer to your question, Peter Thiel is, as we all know, very influential in Silicon Valley, both his thinking about technology, but also about society at large. And it had an effect. Some of the early adopters of what we'll call the New Zealand option were people who had heard about it from him. He had bought a property there and had said, look, I've already checked it out. I'm paraphrasing here, but others in his orbit had checked out the seismology. They said this is safe from earthquakes. They'd looked at the climate change implications and said, okay, we're far enough from the sea where we're not going to be affected by rising sea levels. So it was always interesting to me that the people I was talking to, as one of them said, I keep a helicopter gassed up all the time in San Francisco, and I have an underground filtration system in my bunker right outside of the city. But if that's not good enough, then that's when we go to New Zealand.
The thing I'm always thinking about when I get beyond my total jealousy and envy that they're going to be able to save themselves and their families is, in the event of sort of a end of the world scenario, I know this is very basic, how would they get there?
This is where the plane comes in. If you assume for the moment that it doesn't happen in an instant, it's not a cataclysmic, not a nuclear strike,
right?
Then you probably have a couple of days. As one owner of a high-end luxury bunker complex put it to me, he said, look, I live in Miami. Mm-hmm. And if something happened, let's call it the beginning of a societal breakdown, the first thing everybody would do was that they would flick on the TV and sit around for 2 days watching it unfold on cable. He said, that's your first mistake. You should, if you have already dedicated yourself to the belief that this is coming, that's when you go. That's when you pack up and leave. Look, I think this can sound kind of harrowing, and in a way, it should be a bit of a wake-up call that some of the folks who have been so good at figuring out how our society works, what are the things we want and need as a culture, both in consumer terms and in ideological terms, even before it becomes the main event. Some of those people are quite convinced that these are
necessary.
That these are conflicts. Yeah, that these are necessary. And that's part of the reason why I wrote it. Yeah, I often write, Barry, in a kind of, I guess I'd call it a register of metaphor, where I try to find something that I think is concrete and evocative enough for us to be able to describe it and feel it and touch it, but is actually telling us a story about our country. And I take a lot of inspiration from John McPhee. He wrote a great book in the middle of the 1960s about frozen orange juice, of all things, because what he realized was that frozen orange juice, which really had never existed in any large numbers, had only become possible because we had developed technology during the Second World War in which we were able to use the same machines that processed blood plasma for soldiers on the battlefield could now be redirected to make cans of perfect orange juice that you could open in the morning in Minnesota and, in January. And he used it as a metaphor for understanding, a symbol for understanding our time in the mid-60s. It was the advent of a new kind of marketing culture and a new optimism about what the country could be and also a belief in technology. And in its own way, I came to see these bunkers and these giga yachts as symbols of our time. And I think we're wise to pay attention to them.
One of the reasons that I find the stories about the bunkers not just fascinating and, but chilling is that a lot of the people that are building them have been consistently able to see around corners. As much as, you can disagree with them, not whatever you want about Peter Thiel. He has been right about many things. I think that that's inarguable at this point. And so what does it mean that the people that are able to see around bends are building these kind of bunkers for themselves and their families? There's a random guy on Twitter, I don't even know who this is, but I thought this tweet was so smart and pulled it for this conversation. Here's what he wrote. The people who understand our systems the best are building lifeboats. The architects of our digital future don't believe in that future. They're creating plan B while selling us plan A. What do they know that we don't? Maybe they see how fragile everything really is, how one cyber attack could destroy banking, how social media algorithms are tearing society apart, how wealth concentration, I think this is very true, creates revolutionary conditions. Or maybe he says they can just afford to be paranoid. You talk in the book and in your writing about how, what this class is doing is sort of not trying to prevent catastrophe for all of us, but withdrawing from it. The way my wife Nellie talks about it is that we don't really have a noblesse oblige. We have an elite class with all of the noblesse and none of the oblige. And I think that's very true. Maybe it's always been the case that those that have the most to fear. But I wonder if that's true or if there's something profoundly different about this class in this moment.
I think we've hit on really the heart of the matter, which is that as it is in any small town or in any high school or in any enormously powerful cohort of individuals, there are cultures and norms and moral expectations and standards of one another. And these things move quite distinctly over time. There was a period, of course, in the Gilded Age when it was considered to be not just fine, but celebrated to use your money for completely ridiculous things. There was a famous party where somebody rented out a ballroom in New York City and then brought in an entire herd of horses for people to sit on at dinner while they could eat their feast while sipping champagne from the saddlebags. There was another party where people hid rubies and diamonds in a pile of sand and then gave trowels to their guests who then dug out the gems and took them home. And the way that came to an end was because it became clear, not only to the public, who was, of course, getting increasingly desperate and angry, that this was unsustainable. It also became clear to some of the elites at the top. I had a fascinating couple of conversations with Richard White, one of the great scholars of the Gilded Age, who said there was a lot of similarity to what's happening now. You had the advent of tremendous new technology. You had the creation of the telephone, the elevator. Things that just transformed our way of imagining ourselves. But you also had life expectancy among the poorest Americans dropping in a way that reminds me, frankly, of West Virginia, where I started my career in journalism. You see it in distinct terms. If you live in McDowell County, West Virginia, your life expectancy as an adult male is 18 years less than if you go over the border into Virginia to Fairfax County. So what happened is that at a certain point, there were people who came to believe, and some of them were members of the Teddy Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt family, that if we keep down this path, we will find ourselves falling apart. There was a cohort of Americans who looked at the Russian Revolution and said, this is what happens if a society fails to take heed of the distress of the people at the bottom. And part of the reason why Carnegie is remembered today is because he looked around and he said, if we continue on the path we're on, we'll end up, as he put it, in a world of rigid castes defined by mutual ignorance and mutual distrust. And his solution in the technology of 100 years ago was to begin building libraries, to increase public knowledge, to equip people who had none of the advantages that he had with the ability to move up in the labor force and to establish themselves and to get a piece of the American dream. John D. Rockefeller gave away half of his fortune. He gave the rest to his son, who gave away 90% of the rest. Created the University of Chicago, created institutions that have enduring civic binding power. And we've had generations more recently that also used their fortunes that way. Warren Buffett, Bill Gates. Look, nobody in this crowd is a simple, perfect person. But what they are is a signaling power to their peers.
But I think that analogy to the library system or the university system is really apt, because with the Giving Pledge, right, which was all the rage like 10, 15 years ago, now I feel like it's sort of gone away. I don't feel like it changed the social dynamic at all in this country. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that.
I think you're right. It doesn't mean it was unimportant, partly because the cultural shadow cast by somebody like Warren Buffett, who is in his way kind of mutually agreed upon as our most successful investor, that when he was showing everybody that he was giving away the bulk of his fortune, let's assume that had some effect on the people who were coming up behind him. I happen to know that, for instance, a young Mark Zuckerberg was really inspired by Bill Gates's work on philanthropy, and his initial take at it was that he created a philanthropic enterprise very similar to the Gates Foundation. Zuckerberg's gone another way since then, but that gets partly to this point about the culture. But I think what you're really getting at is that didn't actually prevent the concentration of wealth we're talking about.
And I'm not criticizing the Giving Pledge. What I'm saying is, where's the release valve? Like, if I don't think that there is, this is a class of people that are enormously intelligent, that see, let's just say the shooting by Luigi Manion, allegedly, of the CEO of United Healthcare, and the celebration in the culture of that act of political violence. There's no way that those people don't see that and think, could that be happening to us? And there's no way that their next thought is not, how do we prevent a politics and a culture where that kind of thing becomes the norm? And I guess the thing I'm thinking about, I don't have the answer to it. I wonder if I'm sure you've been thinking about this too, and perhaps you have a much smarter answer than I do, like what that release valve would be, what the equivalent of the library systems of today might be.
I think that in a way, we know some of the answers. And part of this actually comes to us from Warren Buffett, that remember all those years where he said over and over again, it makes no sense that I, Warren Buffett, have a lower effective tax rate than my secretary. This was his mantra. And for a while, it almost seemed to achieve a level of political salience where it might begin to shape how we think about the tax structure. And in the end, it didn't really produce the effect that he wanted. He wanted changes that would have brought the country perhaps back to something that was closer to what it had been in the latter half of the 20th century than what it is today. This is not a qualitative statement. It's just a statement of fact that the 400 richest Americans today have an effective tax rate that is half of what it was 50 years ago. But for people in the middle, their effective tax rate has stayed the same or has gone up in some cases. So we are actually at a point when the ability to make most use of extraordinary winnings in our system it's become much harder to harness them. And that's why, in a way, I think part of the answer relies in the culture of these folks, because if it becomes clear that we are heading on a path of unsustainability, if you love this country the way that so many really successful entrepreneurs say they do, and I don't doubt their patriotism, then I think it also means having to look pretty clearly in the face and say, am I actually using my windfall to prevent reasonable political steps, policy steps that might ensure that more people at the bottom are able to get a piece of the success? Look, let's be blunt. We're right now talking at a moment when we've just passed a reconciliation bill that will take 17 million people off their health insurance and will create real tax benefits for people at the top of society. That's not according to just me. That's according to the impartial analysis produced by Congress and others. I think that's when we have to recognize that we've entered a period in which a bill like that becomes possible simply because there is so much political influence at the top from people who are in a position to try to advantage their shareholders or themselves, that it really does crowd out the interests and the voice of people at the middle and the bottom. And that's a recipe for trouble.
On my more despairing mornings, I don't want to say I feel like it's too late, because I don't believe that, but I see the political ramifications of everything your book is about playing out very potently in real time. So whether it's, Zohran Mamdani, a socialist who stands to be the next mayor of New York City, who does not disavow the idea of globalizing the intifada, talking about how billionaires should not exist, not poverty should not exist, but billionaires should not exist. And equally, I could see, Tucker Carlson on stage at Turning Point USA this past weekend going on a diatribe about how Bill Ackman's wealth is sort of ill-gotten. And you can see the ends of the horseshoe already have merged in a kind of populist, anti-elite, highly conspiratorial messaging that feels like it has a momentum of its own. That feels very, very difficult to stop at this point. And I guess let's imagine that you, Evan, are in a private, very high trust conversation with people of this class that desperately want to stop that love the country. What would you advise them? What would you advise them to do? Because there's a reason that the message of whether it's, the sort of nationalist populist right, or the socialist left, there's a reason that feels very vital, energetic, and attractive to Americans right now. So what would you advise?
I would say that in a way we have to recognize something that was well put by John Bogle, who some people will certainly remember was almost the inventor of the mutual fund, a massively influential and successful financier. And he said towards the end of his life that, he said, and this was a source of real concern to him, there were things that when I got into this business, you simply didn't do. He said, now it feels to me as if the norm is, if I can do it and get away with it, I will do it. And we are in a period where very often the answer that I get, and I have these kinds of conversations a lot with extremely wealthy, powerful people, the answer is often, look, I have to do simply what the law allows. I have a fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders, to my investors. If I was to somehow say, I'm going to make sure that we're paying more than what we would absolutely have to by not using some of these loopholes and techniques and the most aggressive forms of tax avoidance, well then, okay, maybe you would get a bit of an earful from some of your partners in the short term. But actually, what about the long term? What about the country that really has been responsible for the creation of this success? We had the most prosperous, successful century of human experience in the 20th century, the American century. And it's worth reminding ourselves that it began, in fact, when some of the most powerful people in the country decided that they had to make a change in order to prevent a repeat of the Russian Revolution here. And that meant, let's make sure we're establishing labor protections for people at the bottom. It was also the introduction of the direct election of senators to try to ensure that Washington was actually listening to the public will in a way that it really isn't right now because of the impact of campaign finance. It also meant that we created Social Security and systems that would ensure that with the advent of more automation in our economy, that not people wouldn't be left out on the street. We're at a very similar reckoning point today than we were in the early moments of the 20th century. And we made choices at the time, including by elites, both political and economic, to prevent a level of distress and upheaval at the bottom that would ultimately have torn this country apart. And I think we're approaching a point where we're going to need our leaders of technology and finance to say, I'm going to apply as much energy and creativity and aggression to putting in place protections for people and to think hard about how to mitigate economic shock as I have into creating the technology that will produce that shock.
One of the things that you point out and that I just find a strange paradox is that Trump has won the presidency twice as sort of on a populist, raising up the working class message. There were a lot of other messages in there. I'm going to leave those to the side for a second. And yet, at this second inauguration, he is surrounded by billionaires, all like so many, and you talk about this in your book, that many important members of like Congress and the Senate have to kind of like sit in the back in like the nosebleed sections to make room for the Tim Cooks and the Sergey Brins and the Mark Zuckerbergs. And he also nominated 13 billionaires to the top ranks of his administration. Square that for people. How is it that he has been able to pull off both, to both portray himself as the populist sort of sword of the working class, messenger of the people, and also a billionaire himself, beloved by billionaires, surrounded by them? How does that work?
It is a fact of our time that is probably the hardest thing for people to grasp from far away. I've spent a lot of the last decade interviewing Trump voters. That's been part of my day job. And one of the very distinct things that I take from it is that people will often say about him, look, he expects more of me than just the fact that I might be limping along here on state assistance. That, in some crude way, he is signaling in his own lifestyle and in the way he talks about wealth that maybe he can, eventually usher me into those ranks, that he imagines that somebody can go from being on the outside to being on the inside. And part of that is because we all know he grew up with a massive inheritance, all the advantages that come to a real estate family in New York City. But he was also, in a sense, on the outside of the cultural elite. He was the guy from Queens who didn't have the access to the clubs and the places he wanted. As eventually he bought Mar-a-Lago and turned it into his own club. And, and he talked about it almost explicitly in those terms because he couldn't make it in the club. And so part of the appeal is that he has all of the trappings and the golden toilets of what it means to make it, but he's also a guy who is on the outside of the cultural elite. I came to think a lot about what we mean when we talk about the elite. And in a sense, we love the adjective, Barry. We love talking about Navy SEALs as elite Navy SEALs, but we don't like the Georgetown elite. And we don't like anybody who is standing even just half a rung above us and peering down at us and saying, tut, tut, you're doing it wrong. And that's a very powerful engine. And Trump figured that out.
I think one aspect of the Trump phenomenon, and maybe one sort of like the saving grace of the, let's just say the have-yacht class, broadly speaking, whether they are the quiet luxury sort of the Georgetown elite kind or the sort of nouveau riche, golden toilet, outsider, elite kind. And we don't have enough time to, there's so many different layers to that cake that we could get into that's very fun, but maybe a conversation for another time. Perhaps the sort of thing that protects all of it is the aspirational aspect to it, is that many Americans who are not in that class, the kind of, one version of the American dream is that their kids could ultimately enter into the golden toilet and the have-yacht class. And that is sort of like the essence of America in some kind of way. And I guess the shift that I have felt, and maybe you feel this too, over the past little while, is rather like the aspiration has sort of soured into a we actually have no hope of entering that class, and the class is rigged and the system is rigged and we need to burn it all down. That is, to be glib about it, the shift that I have felt. And I wonder if that's what you're feeling too, and whether your reporting kind of bears that out.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There is this balance that has been at the core of the American idea really since the beginning. I mean, this is, after all, Thomas Jefferson talked about having a country that would have an aristocracy of talent. This would be what would separate us from the Europeans. We wouldn't hand down
There would be no legacy in missions, Evan.
Right, exactly. And for a long time, Americans had this very conflicted view of it. On the one hand, and you see this even today in survey data, people will say 59% of Americans believe that billionaires are making the country less fair, and an almost identical share will tell you they want to become billionaires themselves. So that duality still exists. Americans want to get rich. This is baked into who we are as a people, and frankly, why people come from across the world to try to become Americans.
And that's baked into the founding, right? It's like you have Ben Franklin, the son of a candle. I think it was a candle maker.
Exactly.
You have Hamilton, born out of wedlock, and then, but frankly, you have that same story among some of the people in the have-yacht class, whether it's, Steve Jobs, adopted son, Jeff Bezos, given up for, these are like humdeal. There's a zillion we could point to.
Right. And they're real.
And they're real. And yet it doesn't have the same resonance anymore. That doesn't seem to work anymore. Why?
Because the numbers tell the tale. Those anecdotes are powerful emblems. They're the posters on the wall. The problem is that the actual reality is much less encouraging. If you were a baby born in the United States in 1940, you stood a 90% chance of out-earning your parents. Today, because of the decline of social mobility, that number has dropped by nearly half. So you have half as much of a chance of out-earning your parents as you did before. So Gen Z and millennials are one of the first cohorts in this country's 250-year history that has no expectation of out-earning their parents. That is a really profound change. And it begins to ripple through everything. Because and look, it's worth pointing this in some relief in comparative terms. I was a foreign correspondent for a long time. Believe it or not, China today has greater social mobility, a communist country with a socialist economy, than the United States does, which should give us pause about making sure that, in fact, the foundation of social mobility, of being able to transform yourself, of raise your station from one to the next, that we're not actually living on fumes at this point when it comes to that mythology. What do we do that will begin to reawaken that spark of opportunity? And that's a policy question. And I think that's the thing in the end, that when people are voting for somebody like Mamdani, it's usually refracted through the most immediate forms of concern about cost and affordability. They will talk about rent and talk about how you pay for groceries, which is understandable. The iceberg beneath the surface of the water is actually this much larger fact about the reality that we've never, in sheer data terms, had more money in fewer hands than we've ever had in this country's history.
What will it take for our have-yacht class to be shaken into action, if indeed such action could make a difference? I really did see the Luigi Manion shooting as being a pretty seismic event, and yet didn't seem to really change anything. There are many revolutions against the rich. There's Marie Antoinette, of course, but, the Romanovs and the Bolshevik Revolution. Could you see something like that happening here in America? And B, when you're doing your kind of, Peter Thiel imagination of the fall exercise that I'm sure this book inspired in you, is there an event that could happen, almost like maybe a 9/11 type event, but maybe culturally speaking, that would be sufficient enough to change the dynamic?
Look, I think one of the things we know from history, and I've studied revolutions and moments of social fracture in other countries as part of my work as a reporter, is that very often the spark itself is impossible to anticipate. The Arab Spring, for instance, began with the killing of a fruit seller in Tunisia. So nobody thinks that that was the beginning of the story. What actually it was the ignition of the tinder that was lying around, the kindling. I mean, my last book, Barry, I mean, authors are sometimes said to have one idea that they write about over and over again over the course of a lifetime. And I have been pondering this question of social fragility and inequality for a long time. And the book was called Wildland precisely because that comes out of the world of firefighting, that we've been living in a time in which our society has become drier and more brittle and more prone to ignition. And Luigi Manion is one blinking alarm that should wake people up to the idea that a kid who was raised in upper middle class prosperity around Baltimore, had a great education, and then found himself ultimately using violence in the most terrifying way against somebody that he chose as a symbol of an abusive system that he found to be morally illegitimate. If that's not a wake-up call, then I don't know what is. But here's the thing. This is the part that gives me real hope about this, which is that having lived in a lot of countries, one of the things I've learned about the United States is that our culture is quite plastic and nimble, and it moves faster than other places, partly because we're a young country, relatively speaking. And 10 years ago, it was considered unimaginable to be a technology company involved in questions of national defense. People said, well, we don't think that's appropriate. We don't want to have anything. There was a walkout at Google among employees. And then you actually saw a change in which you now have leaders in the technology world who say, no, I think it's important to help the United States and its allies defend Ukraine, for instance, from Vladimir Putin. And that means we have to be involved. That's a case in which an idea took hold among some of the most powerful entrepreneurial people in this country, the richest people in some cases, and it spread like wildfire. And I believe that a more robust understanding of what it's going to take to revive opportunity in this country can become a cultural norm among powerful people. This is not just me talking. Paul Tudor Jones, one of the most successful hedge fund investors in our history, has said that if we continue on the path of economic inequality that we're on, we are ignoring what history tells us, which is that it ends in either war or revolution or a confiscatory tax regime. So you can either get a hold of it beforehand and try to figure out how to restore opportunity, or you can wait until it's too late. My view is that we're at the point of a reckoning now, and I think it's time for people to take that pretty seriously.
I want to take one beat on who the revolutionaries are, because I think it's unlikely, right? So just in the case of Luigi Manion, upper middle class, I think he went to Penn or something like Ivy League educated or elite right. Educated kid. And there's this paradox because, you have people like Steven Pinker and others who say, what's everyone freaking out about? Things have never been better. Hunger's down. Literacy is up. We have unbelievable medical and scientific advances. Life expectancy has never been higher. Why is everyone complaining? And the very people that are complaining are the sort of upper middle class types, the types of people that vote for Zohran Mamdani, the type of person in the case of Luigi Manion that kills the United Healthcare Workers CEO. Why is that? Because that is a consistent story in history.
Because it tends to be that the people at the bottom of a society are so busy just getting through the day and getting up in the morning and trying to, put shoes on their kids' feet, that they're not really thinking about systemic issues. When we think about opportunity and the deprivation of our dreams, it tends to be on a relative basis, not on an absolute basis. You compare yourself to what your parents were graduating into and the sense of opportunity that was available to them in the 50s or the 40s or later. And I think that's the key thing to remember, that it tends to be that revolutionaries come from a position where they have enough altitude in society to understand not only what they have, but what they are unable to get access to. Ho Chi Minh and Deng Xiaoping spoke French because they were able to go overseas. They were educated. They had read. And I think we are wise to remember that we're living at a moment when our technology has actually made it much easier for people to be fluent and aware of all the things that make them angry because they don't have them. It used to be that nobody would have seen a wedding in Venice on the opposite side of the world. Now you can see it instantly
now
on
you
your
go
phone
to the Daily Mail.
anytime. Exactly.
One element that we haven't spoken about yet, and I want us to talk about it just for a few minutes, is the impact that AI is going to have on this whole story of profound economic inequality. Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, said recently in an interview that him and his friends have a betting pool for when there's going to be $1 billion company operated by one employee, presumably that company being AI driven or AI entirely other than that person. So Sam Altman thinks that's going to happen. And I think much of the conversation we heard over the past few days is that that is not something that's going to happen 10 years from now, but perhaps 6 months from now, a year from now. One of the only policy ideas that is talked about in relationship to the decimation of white-collar jobs is UBI. I personally do not think UBI is something that would work at all, but that's sort of like the only original idea. So talk to me about, A, policy ideas that you hear being discussed around this very eminent problem, and then B, just laying out for us the picture of the next few years about how you see that sort of pouring fuel on this already raging fire.
Yeah, this is an issue that has gone from being quietly discussed, almost whispered on the sidelines of business conferences, to now suddenly becoming center stage. Just recently, we saw the CEO of Ford Motor Company talk about the fact that half of all white-collar jobs, as he put it, are going away. I think he was, in a way, digesting some statistics that have been offered by Dario Amodei of Anthropic and others who have proposed estimates for the number of jobs that are going away. But, it is proceeding in a pretty dramatic way because it was expected originally that it would actually be blue-collar jobs that would vanish first. You guys published a superb piece recently, Tyler Cowen and Avital Balwit. I loved that story because what it did was it said, look, this is what's coming. Not only is it going to mean that our jobs are suddenly in much shorter supply, that kids coming out of school, as we're already seeing today, are finding themselves in a much harder position to find that first job and get that first rung on the job ladder, but also our whole sense of purpose as an individual. I mean, in the first time that you pick up your phone and realize that it is able to do your job better than you are, to reach judgments, to parse complicated, conflicting pieces of information, that's going to be also a crisis of meaning and purpose in our society. And I think that the idea of UBI, universal basic income, really doesn't account for that fact. People work partly because it is about meaning and identity and drive. It's baked into us as a species to get up in the morning and want to accomplish something by day's end. We all want to go off and have a vacation, maybe go out on that yacht. But let's be honest, we want to spend time building things and making things. I have heard conflicting scenarios. The optimists will tell you that after the advent of the ATM machine, that we actually created more jobs for bank tellers in the generation since then. That's a statistical fact. They just have different jobs than they had before. They're not standing at a window giving out cash. They're talking to clients and customers about financing and about credit products and things like that. It just changed what it meant to work at a bank branch. But that is the optimistic scenario, because what we're really dealing with is a technology that has the ability to eliminate entire classes of employment. And it's not because I haven't looked, Barry. I have not found a technologist who is giving me a really precise plan for how he or she expects to manage this transition with any real social stability and cohesion. And this matters to me personally because I spent a long time in China. I wrote about what the advent of the China trade meant for the United States, getting into the WTO. I would write about it on the ground in China. And then I came back to the United States. And I have a lot of family in Michigan. And one of the things I found was that we had failed our workers in places like Michigan by not anticipating and properly preparing them and the economy to absorb the shock of the China trade, to absorb the reality of what was about to happen. And I fear that we're actually careening towards an AI labor shock of the kind that we had on China, and we're whistling past the opportunity to put in and lay in the planning that will make this productive instead of really painful and disruptive.
You write in your book about how the fall of Rome took 500 years, but the historian Ramsay MacMullen wrote that it could be compressed into just 3 words: fewer have more. Will that ultimately be the story of the fall of the American empire?
It doesn't have to be. In my view, this is the policy choice. This is the moment of reckoning for us. We will ignore that history at our peril because the history is as eloquent and succinct as Ramsay MacMullen put it. Towards the end of the Roman Empire, a typical farmer made about 5 pieces of gold per year. A senator in the Roman Empire made about 200,000 pieces of gold per year. And you can easily make that analogy to where we are today and the distress signals that are being thrown up by society, the flares. And the goal for us now is to talk bluntly, candidly, vibrantly about this problem. I'll be honest, probably more than I should be. Part of the reason to write a book with yachts in the title is that I can help draw people in to a subject that is inherently interesting to us just as a sociology and a kind of a fascinating bit of pop culture. But really the subtext is, this is our moment to recognize what has made this country survive for 200 years, what has made this country survive for 250 years, is by being resilient and adaptable and reading the room and recognizing when we have to make some smart changes.
Evan Osnos, are you ready for a very quick lightning round?
I'm ready.
Who's your favorite billionaire?
Warren Buffett.
Who's your least favorite billionaire?
Vladimir Putin.
Great dodge. I love that. Who has the best yacht?
Barry Diller and Dion von Furstenberg.
Why is it the best?
Everybody basically seems to agree that they took the aesthetic understanding that she has and paired it to the sense of ambition that he has, and you ended up with something that everybody else has been copying ever since. To be perfectly honest, Jeff Bezos' yacht is a sort of like the Diller's yacht, but blown up by a couple 100%.
The other big yacht that people talk about is David Geffen's. Have you been on that one?
I haven't. But it is one of the ones that Bruce Springsteen and Barack Obama seem happy to go on, even when it perhaps brings up the aroma of hypocrisy. But there we are.
If you could have a yacht, Evan, let's say someone gifted it to you, would you take it, and would you prefer a Danish or Italian-made yacht?
I would never take it because the management of it, the maintenance of it, is 10% of the sale price. So, Barry, if you're about to give me a $500 million yacht, that means I have to have $50 million a year to keep it afloat. So, no, I'm gonna stick with my kayak, I think.
There's a very old adage that money doesn't buy happiness. Do you think that's true?
I think it can.
Or is that the ultimate cope of the poor?
Well, the truth is that it can buy you happiness for a while, and it can make you quite contented. Unfortunately, as a species, we are biologically created to live on what's known as the hedonic treadmill, which is that the feeling of satisfaction that you get from something begins to dissipate the very moment that you either drive it out of the lot or sail it out of the marina. And so the real subject, the real problem is insatiability. That's the enemy. And if you can harness that, if you can actually master that and bring it under control, then you're in charge of your own happiness. I'm starting to sound like a wellness guru, except that this is a subject that is so clear from everything I've reported on over the years that it strikes me as the real truth that's hiding in plain sight.
Biggest difference between old money billionaires and the new money, the tech, crypto, et cetera, guys?
Mothballs.
Perfect. Are you yourself, Evan, prepping for a doomsday scenario?
Oh, God, no. I think I have like 3 cans of beans in the cupboard. I think that we're actually able to avert the worst consequences. And not to be unlightning round about it, but just very briefly, my family, my Jewish side of my family, we lost everything in 1939. My grandfather was one of 7 siblings in Warsaw. He's the only one who survived. Our family has had to get up and go and move within 1 century. This is very, very personal and real in my mind. And I am too much of a believer in the American system, as flawed and as damaged as it is, but it's the very system that attracted us to come over here almost a century ago. I really believe that we are capable, if we talk about it in honest and candid ways about the fact that this is unsustainable, that we can, shall we say, steer the ship before it hits the shoals.
Well, Evan, it's not a lightning round answer, but it's a perfect way to end this conversation. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for coming on Honestly.
My pleasure, Barry. It's just a treat to be with you.